For 5 years before COVID, I worked at the shoe store downtown, and there was a man named Lewis who came in from time to use the phone because he didn't have one. We never spoke much past hello and my asking if he needed to use the phone. This was partly because he spoke so little, and partly because I had no idea what common ground we might have to talk about. But I knew that he was a very nice person. Eventually, he got a free phone, but still came in from time to time because he had so few minutes each month. I don't know if he was unhoused. I think he was at first, and then at some point, he got a subsidized apartment. Lewis was so thin, he looked like a stiff breeze would blow him away, and his face showed constant exhaustion and poor health. From all of this, I made assumptions about Lewis. I assumed he came from a family with very limited resources and had never had access to a decent education, among other things. On this, I was so very wrong. Not surprisingly, given his frail health, Lewis was an early victim of COVID. I happened to go through the bank drive-thru one day in the summer of 2020, and the teller, who knew us both, told me of his passing. She happened to have the bulletin from his funeral and gave it to me. I kept that bulletin to remind myself about making assumptions about people based on how they look and where they are in life. I don't remember all the details because I put that bulletin away so well to keep from losing it that I can't find it. You know, that very safe place that we all have. I do remember, though, that that's where I learned that Lewis came from a very well-educated family, and he had at least a bachelor's degree and possibly a master's. I don't remember. He also worked at Spring Arbor for a time, I think as an instructor. I have no idea what happened to him after Spring Arbor because it wasn't in his biography, but this time I'm not making any more assumptions. It's very easy to make assumptions and perhaps judgments about a person based on our first impression of how they look and where they are in life, instead of stopping to remember that they've had a lot of years before that moment. And even if those assumptions are right, I personally need to remind myself not to judge where they are. As I read somewhere, don't judge the choices someone else has made when we don't know the options they were offered. And that's exactly why Jesus told us not to worry about the speck in someone else's eye until we take care of the log in our own. I realized a while back I've led a pretty sheltered life. Even when things were bad, like when Randy was at sea for 3 months and the Navy messed up our pay and took some back, and things were really tight, we still had our family to depend on, both his parents and my parents. As hard as I might try, I will never fully understand the feeling of losing everything because my company downsized and fired me, or facing the choice of making bad decisions or letting my family go hungry because the government cut funding for food stamps. That was a good thing to remember when I was answering the phone for Love in the Name of Christ, and the man called for help to get a state ID because he'd just gotten out of prison. At the end of the conversation, he thanked me for my help and for not judging him. It helped that in recent years, I had learned that not everyone in prison is guilty. Yet another reason not to judge. That and the fact that I need to remind myself of the bad and sometimes really stupid decisions that I've made from time to time. Now it's the law in Michigan that they issue a state ID when someone is released from prison, but the photographers always make sure that that orange stripe on the collar shows, so when someone looks at it, they know that this is someone who was just released from prison. A while back, I drove a friend to a food pantry. The woman saw the stripe on his ID and made some snarky comments. Even when he got a new ID, she continued to make those comments when he went there, so he stopped going, even though he really could use the food. There's also the lady that Ainsley told me about that she knows, an unhoused woman in Oregon. In order to get a job, people need a Social Security card. They need an ID to get that Social Security card. A person needs an ID to get a birth certificate, and a birth certificate to get an ID. When a person has no ID, I have learned through working at Love that they can start with mail with their name and an address on it. But an unhoused person doesn't have an address or mail. It is possible for them to get an ID, but it's a very long and complicated process. First, it takes over a year to get to the top of the list to start the process, and then months to get through the process. This woman that Ainsley knows had gotten all the way through, and she finally had that Social Security card so that she could try to find a job, assuming she could get cleaned up enough for an interview, which is another challenge when you're unhoused. But then the police raided the camp where she was living and took everything, including that Social Security card. So now she has to start all over from the very beginning. It's illegal in Oregon to do what they did, but the police do it anyway. Eventually, the courts will catch up and they will have to stop, but the damage has already been done. So who's at fault here that this woman doesn't have a job? In the political climate of the past years, it's becoming harder and harder for me to remember not to judge. We see it all over media and social media. People of privilege, money, and power doing and saying things that are racist, homophobic, ableist, and just plain cruel. I've seen people laughing at other people's misfortune and mistreatment. One day, I was talking with a friend, and he called me on it. He, of all people, has so much reason to be angry at those people and at the system. But as we were talking about one particular person, he reminded me that that person has to be absolutely miserable inside. I wish I had his strength and forgiveness. So what do we do to try to learn not to assume and judge? I've learned that reading stories, both fiction and nonfiction, is a great way to see into other people's lives, to see their humanity and suffering and their realities that we've never experienced, and that helps us lead to empathy. In fact, just last night after I wrote this, I read, "Nonfiction teaches us empathy through facts, and fiction teaches us empathy through imagination." Traveling can be eye-opening too. Ainsley learned a lot when she spent that year in Colombia. For example, the YAV program that she was in made sure that she lived with a family who had access to potable water, which, where she lived, had to be purchased from a nearby village. But many in the village where she stayed couldn't afford it, so they drank water that was less than clean, to put it nicely, because that's what was available to them. That was the year that the water in Flint became so corrosive no one could drink it. The people in her village didn't understand the uproar over bad water. They lived with it all their lives. Maybe it would help to move out of our comfort zone. Back in 2014, Jenny Whitford mentioned PFLAG in a sermon. It stands for Parents, Friends, and Family of Lesbians and Gays. So I decided to go to a meeting and just say, "Hi, I'm an ally." I was a little nervous about going into a new group of people, but I've rarely ever felt so welcome in my life. Since then, I've made some very good friends and learned about struggles that I've never experienced. Karen Myers, Randy, and I volunteer at Cafe Connection on Wednesday evenings. We meet a lot of people there. Many are not in a good place financially, and some are unhoused, but they are all good people. This is not to say that all of us have not had bad times, but the main thing is to try to look outside of our experience and see that some people's options are not anywhere near what ours are, and try to find empathy for them. Amen.